Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as one of history's greatest military minds, but what makes his story really interesting is that he didn't start out looking like a man who was destined to rule Europe. He was born on August 15th, 1769, on the island of Corsica, right after the French had crushed a local rebellion. So from the beginning, Napoleon entered a world shaped by defeat, occupation, and resentment. That mattered because his family sat in an awkward position. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, had once supported Corsican resistance, but after the French won, he switched sides and worked with the new rulers. He built a respectable career and got the family into elite circles, but Napoleon never fully respected that choice. To him, it looked like surrender. His mother, Letizia, was the opposite kind of influence. She was strong, strict, and resilient, and Napoleon later gave her a huge amount of credit for the toughness that defined him for the rest of his life. As a boy, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend military school at Brienne. And this is where you start to see the pattern that follows him through his whole life. He was an outsider right away. He spoke French badly, had a Corsican accent, came from a background that wasn't truly wealthy, and didn't fit in with the polished sons of the French elite. He got mocked, isolated himself, and developed that cold, defensive shell people would later mistake for pure confidence. At school, he became serious, withdrawn, and incredibly stubborn. Still, military education gave him something he desperately needed: structure, purpose, and a ladder to climb. He trained as an artillery officer, which suited him perfectly because artillery rewarded intelligence, calculation, and precision more than aristocratic charm. He was good at it. But by the time he was a young officer, Napoleon ran into a problem that a lot of ambitious men hit under the old system. Talent alone wasn't enough. Advancement still depended heavily on birth, money, and connections. He had some connections through his father, but not enough to rise quickly. He felt stuck, and he hated feeling stuck. Then the French Revolution exploded in 1789, and suddenly the whole old order began to crack apart. For Napoleon, this was less about idealism and more about opportunity. He wasn't some romantic revolutionary in the beginning, but he absolutely understood that revolution could destroy the system that had been blocking him. He tried to build influence back in Corsica, hoping to rise there politically, but that went badly. He clashed with local leaders, overplayed his hand, and ended up forced to flee with his family to France in 1793. That failure turned out to be important. It pushed him to stop thinking of himself mainly as Corsican and start thinking as French. And once he made that shift, his rise became much faster. Back in the French army, he was sent to Toulon, where royalists had rebelled and invited British support. Napoleon saw immediately what needed to be done. He brought in artillery, repositioned the guns, trained the men hard, and when the assault came, he led from the front. The French retook the city, the British pulled back, and suddenly this young officer was being noticed. That victory made Napoleon's rise feel less like luck and more like destiny. After proving himself at Toulon, Napoleon's rise stopped feeling lucky and started feeling inevitable. He had shown that he could see a battlefield clearly, move fast, and make bold decisions without freezing under pressure. And in revolutionary France, that kind of man suddenly had room to move. In 1795, Paris was in chaos again. The government was weak, angry crowds were gathering, and the people in charge needed someone who could save them fast. Napoleon got the job. He set up cannon around key streets and buildings, and when the royalist forces advanced, he didn't hesitate. He blasted them with grapeshot at close range and crushed the uprising. It was brutal, direct, and effective. That one moment made it clear that Napoleon was not just a battlefield commander. He was also someone willing to use force to shape politics. Not long after that, he was given command of the French army in Italy. On paper, it didn't look glamorous. The army was badly supplied, poorly fed, and low on morale. But Napoleon walked in and immediately gave the troops something they hadn't had in a while: belief. He told them they were poor now, but victory would bring them honor, wealth, and glory. It was classic Napoleon. He knew how to speak to men in a way that made them feel like history was waiting for them personally. And then he backed it up. The Italian campaign turned him into a star. He moved quickly, split enemy forces, attacked before they were ready, and won battle after battle against the Austrians and their allies. This is where his reputation as a military genius really started to grow. He was younger than many of the men under him, but he had that rare quality where people wanted to follow him anyway. He looked calm, seemed certain, and always acted like he already knew how things were going to end. He also understood publicity better than almost anyone else in his era. Napoleon didn't just win battles. He made sure people heard about them in exactly the right way. He wrote bulletins, shaped the story, and turned military victories into political power. That part matters, because Napoleon wasn't only building an army, he was building a legend. After more success abroad, including the Egyptian campaign, he returned to France in 1799. The country was a mess. The government was unstable. Money was tight. The war situation was worrying, and people were tired of disorder. Napoleon arrived at exactly the right moment. With support from the army and important political figures, he helped carry out a coup. A new government was set up with 3 consuls, but everyone knew who the real power was. Napoleon moved quickly, just like always. He pushed aside rivals, reshaped the constitution, and became first consul. Officially, France was still a republic. In reality, one man was now at the center of everything, and this is the key shift in Napoleon's story. Up to this point, he had been the brilliant outsider climbing the ladder. Now, he was the system. He wasn't just fighting for France anymore. He was becoming France, at least in political terms. He offered order after chaos, success after failure, and national pride after years of confusion. A lot of French people were happy to accept that deal, because after revolution, terror, violence, and instability, many people were no longer asking for freedom in some idealistic sense. They were asking for safety, competence, and someone who could make the country feel strong again. Napoleon gave them exactly that. And next, he would go even further from ruler in practice to emperor in name. Now that Napoleon was the most powerful man in France, he wanted to prove he could do more than grab power. He wanted to show he could keep it, expand it, and build something lasting around himself. First, he had to deal with Austria again. The Austrians had taken back much of the territory France had won in Italy, and Napoleon was not about to let that stand. So, in the spring of 1800, he led his army across the Alps in one of the most famous military moves of his career. It was a brutal crossing. Men dragged artillery through snow and ice over steep mountain passes, exhausted and half-frozen. But Napoleon believed in dramatic moves, especially the kind that caught enemies off guard. That campaign led to the Battle of Marengo on June 14, 1800. At one point, the French looked close to defeat, but Napoleon managed to turn the battle around and claim victory. It mattered for more than just military reasons. Marengo helped secure his political control back in France. It let him present himself not just as a clever politician, but as the unbeatable man of action the country needed. That image only grew stronger over the next few years. Britain was still his biggest enemy, especially at sea, but on land, Napoleon seemed almost unstoppable. He reorganized the French state, tightened his grip on power, and made himself central to everything. Then, in 1804, he made the biggest move of all. He crowned himself Emperor of the French. That moment tells you a lot about him. He didn't want to be handed power by tradition, or by the church, or by old royal bloodlines. He wanted the world to see that he had taken it himself. In the famous ceremony, he placed the crown on his own head. It was theatrical, bold, and very Napoleon. He was saying, in effect, I made myself. Then came his greatest military masterpiece, Austerlitz. On December 2nd, 1805, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Austria and Russia. The enemy army was larger, and on paper, this should have been a huge challenge. But Napoleon tricked them. He made his position look weaker than it was, encouraged them to attack where he wanted, and then struck hard through the center when they exposed themselves. The result was a crushing French victory. Austerlitz became the battle that defined his genius. It wasn't just that he won, it was the way he won. He seemed to understand movement, timing, and psychology better than anyone else on the field. After that, his legend was no longer just French. It was European. For the next several years, victory kept coming. He defeated Prussia, beat other coalitions, and pushed French power across much of the continent. Kingdoms were rearranged, borders changed, rulers were removed. In many places, Napoleon either controlled events directly or installed people loyal to him. Europe started to look less like a patchwork of old monarchies and more like a system built around one man. But there was a problem with all this success. The bigger Napoleon's empire became, the harder it was to control. He was brilliant, but he was also becoming overconfident. He expected constant victory because constant victory had become normal. And that mindset led him toward the decision that would break everything: Russia. In 1812, Napoleon launched a massive invasion with an enormous army, around 600,000 men. It was one of the largest military efforts Europe had ever seen. But the Russians refused to give him the kind of clean, decisive battle he wanted. Instead, they kept retreating deeper into their own territory, burning crops, villages, and supplies as they went. They gave ground, but they denied him comfort, food, and momentum. Napoleon pushed on anyway. He reached Moscow, but instead of finding a city ready to surrender, he found it largely empty and soon in flames. He had marched deep into Russia and gained almost nothing that could actually save the campaign. Then came the retreat. This is where everything truly started to collapse. Cold, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and constant Russian attacks tore the French army apart. Men froze to death. Horses died. Discipline broke down. What had entered Russia as a mighty imperial force came back as a shattered wreck. Napoleon had built his career on speed, control, and confidence. In Russia, he lost all three. And once Europe saw that he could be beaten, his enemies moved in fast. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon was still Napoleon, which meant he did not quietly accept that it was over. But by this point, Europe had changed. His enemies had seen the cracks. They now knew that the man who had seemed unbeatable could, in fact, be broken. In 1813, a new coalition formed against him. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and other powers all wanted the same thing now, not just to slow Napoleon down, but to remove him completely. The key blow came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, sometimes called the Battle of the Nations. It was one of the biggest battles Europe had ever seen, and for Napoleon, it was a disaster. French forces were beaten back, badly damaged, and left in retreat. Once that happened, the road into France was open. Napoleon returned to Paris and found that even at home, support was slipping. The Senate turned against him. Politicians lost faith. Even some of his generals, men who had followed him through years of campaigns, started to accept that the game was up. In April 1814, he abdicated and was sent into exile on the island of Elba. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But Napoleon was not most people. He spent only about 10 months on Elba before deciding he was coming back. And honestly, the comeback is one of the wildest episodes in political history. In February 1815, he escaped the island, landed back in France with a small group of loyal men, and began marching toward Paris. The government sent troops to stop him. This could have ended right there. But Napoleon understood people as well as he understood battle. When soldiers confronted him, he stepped forward and basically dared them to shoot their emperor. Instead of arresting him, many joined him. That tells you everything about the strange hold he still had over men. He wasn't just feared, he was believed in. As he moved north, more troops rallied to him. The king, Louis XVIII, fled Paris, and just like that, Napoleon was back in power. It sounds impossible, but it happened. This period became known as the 100 Days. Still, Europe was not going to let him rebuild his empire. The Allied powers immediately prepared for war again. This time, they were determined to finish it for good. That final showdown came at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, in present-day Belgium. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's army, with Prussian forces moving in to support the Allies. The battle has been argued over for generations, because there were a lot of reasons things went wrong. The ground was muddy. Napoleon delayed the attack. Coordination failed. Some of his decisions came too late. The Prussians arrived in time to hit the French hard. And once the Imperial Guard, his most trusted troops, failed to turn the battle, the whole thing collapsed. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was the end. 4 days later, Napoleon abdicated again, but this time, nobody was taking chances. He was sent far away to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, about as far from Europe as his enemies could reasonably put him. And that was where one of the most restless men in history spent his final years. That's part of what makes Napoleon's ending so striking. This was a man who had spent his life moving, planning, commanding, reshaping maps, and forcing history to react to him. On St. Helena, there was none of that. No armies, no dramatic speeches, no capitals to enter, no comeback left. Just isolation, routine, bitterness, and time. He filled some of that time by talking about his life, shaping his own legend the way he always had. Even in defeat, Napoleon was still working on the story of Napoleon. He wanted history to remember him not as a tyrant who overreached, but as a giant brought down by fate, betrayal, and the stubborn resistance of lesser men. He died there on May 5, 1821, probably of stomach cancer, at the age of 51. And that really is the strange thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a military genius, yes, but he was also a master of image, myth, and performance. He didn't just win battles. He turned himself into an idea. To some, he was a hero who rose by talent in a world once ruled by birth. To others, he was an egotist whose ambition consumed Europe. Both versions are true, at least a little. That's why people are still arguing about him 2 centuries later. Napoleon didn't just leave behind a legacy. He left behind a fight over what that legacy means. All right. If you made it through this session today, that already says something about your discipline. This repetition and consistency combination might look boring on paper, but it is one of the most powerful ways to build fluent, natural English. Keep showing up like this, and your brain will slowly adapt. Trust the process. If this helped even a little, consider liking the video or subscribing. It lets me know these sessions are actually making a difference. We'll catch up again soon. Take care till then.